In the middle of last year, I was walking through Copenhagen when I received a message from my family. My paternal grandmother had died in Cuba. In the hours that followed, she would be cremated, her ashes would be placed on the Havana seawall, and my family wanted me, from a distance, to be there. I was in Copenhagen because I would be giving a talk on the freedom of expression in Cuba. The next day, at the time my family was walking over the reefs of the Malecón, I was walking through a canal full of vintage boats, colorful houses, and squadrons of foreigners. As my family spilled ashes into the sea on a blue sky day in Caribbean, I dropped a purple flower, my grandmother's favorite color, which I plucked from a restaurant garden into the dark, cold water of a gray day in Europe. That is how I said goodbye to my grandmother, with whom I no longer had any relationship. On that day, I was still 33 years old, and I had left Cuba for the first time a few months earlier. The Cuban regime had pushed me into exile. At a very young age, I had gone to live with my paternal grandparents. I grew up with them and not my parents. The reason? My grandparents' house, there was 2 television sets, and I could enjoy the sports channel without conflict, something impossible in my house, where there were about 10 people living and where there was only 1 television. My grandparents had 2 televisions because my paternal grandfather had fought in the underground movements before 1959. Then, when what they called the revolution came to power, my grandfather became one of Fidel Castro's bodyguards. If you have seen the mythical image of Castro throwing himself out of a tank in the Bay of Pigs, you have seen my grandfather. He is the one at Castro's side. Years later, he would also be the escort of Ernesto Che Guevara, who ended up being the best man at my grandparents' wedding. In the house where I grew up, there is a photo of my grandparents' weddings. In a corner, holding a plastic cup with mojito, it's Che Guevara. In that house, surrounded by photographs of Castro and Che, I wrote my first journalistic articles, where I tried to begin to bring to light all the dark areas of my country that had been hidden for more than 6 decades. By that time, my grandfather had passed away. In Cuba, by law, it is impossible to do journalism beyond the umbrella of the Communist Party. Because the Communist Party, beyond being the only political organization allowed in the country, is the only one that runs all the newspapers, all the magazines, all the radio stations, and all the television channels. Therefore, the Cuban media does not do journalism, but does propaganda. That is why, when in the magazine, when I first started with my group of friends to talk about the truth of the life in Cuba and of the system of public health and education system and the repression of the opposition, the regime accused us of violating the laws, and then on they began to repress us. My daily life became one of house arrests, kidnappings, interrogations, jail, threats of imprisonment, interception of my private communications, constant surveillance, and reprisals against my family and friends who were also taken to jail and expelled from their jobs. In addition, they imposed on me a sanction that implied I could not leave the country, a kind of political prison on the island. When all that started to happen, I was no longer living with my grandmother, who told me that all that was happening was the cost of betraying my family. This caused the relationship to break down until it disappeared. The end of our relationship came when a policeman knocked on the door of my new house to give me a police summons without me having committed any crime. My son had been born a month earlier. I went to the station because if I didn't, I was breaking the law. I was not complying with the state order and could be committing a crime. At the station, some men dressed as civilians took me into a room, lowered the blinds, stripped me naked, handcuffed me, and then put me in a car. The car started, and I didn't know where I was going. They forced me to keep my head in between my feet so I could not see where we were going. On the way, they made aggressive U-turns to make me dizzy and vomit. They laughed and asked if I was okay in a mocking tone. It was the day I was most afraid for myself and the day I hated the regime the most. There they stayed for 15 hours for me. They threatened me about ending my life and with jail and destroying my family. I, who had just become a father, feared for the first time for my son, who was only 2 months old. But in addition, they recorded me without my knowledge. A few hours later, they published my manipulated and edited minute on the evening news. They said I was a CIA agent and that I wanted to subvert the internal order of the country. Like all of Cuba, my grandmother saw the image on the television sets. It was the last time she saw me in person. From then on, she neither answered my phone calls nor received me at her house. With a lot of anger and without so much pain at the moment, I accepted her arbitrary decision. Months later, when the regime forced me into exile, declaring that if I did not leave the country I would go to jail, I could not even give her a farewell hug. In Copenhagen, as I dropped a flower into the sea in tribute, I understood that the greatest damage the regime has done is to separate thousands of families for the simple reason of thinking differently. A few weeks ago, my son returned to Cuba, where I cannot return, from where he left when he was 1 year old. He went with his mother to visit my family, my parents, his grandparents, whom I do not know when I will see again. He also went to walk the streets of the country where he was born, whose government continues to denigrate me in its media. Although it was full of rage and impotence for not being able to do it myself, unlike my grandmother, I pushed the hatred aside and asked him to enjoy himself. Today I live in Barcelona. In my living room, there is full of pictures of Cuba and a flag. I want my son to be and feel Cuban, even if he doesn't grow up there. I will not allow them to take away from him, like they did to me, the family, and the country. Thank you so much.